And I think on that note, I will introduce Ashley. Like I said, you all know, a native New Yorker, which makes it even more remarkable that she would write such a real book that I believed every word of from the West or going West and being West. But let's see, you have also been so many things. For her first book, her debut novel, Eliza Waite, she won the Nancy Pearl Book Award, and we are going to hear about many awards for this one, I'm sure. And she has been a journalist, teacher, community activist. She served as a Vista volunteer. She early in her career, she was a humor columnist and worked for the Leiden Tribune in Washington, garnering many awards. She taught English journalism, so and all kinds of other things. There's just she has one of those careers that writers need to have that encompass everything and make them more world citizens of the world. The Stanford publishing course, the masters of education, the degrees are all wonderful that you have. Um, from Wheaton College, all that's wonderful. But I think what you've done after probably just was the icing it made the cake real. So I'm going to, without any more further ado, switch over and let Ashley, who you are here to see, have her event. So Ashley,
Great.
um,
Thank you so much, Susan. And I'm so happy to see so many of you. My dad on here, other author friends, friends from Tucson, friends from my book club here and in Tucson, and people I know from online book clubs, and then a number of you who I don't know. So thank you. And especially those in Prescott. I really thank you for being here. Pam and Joni and Dale and Lynn and Court. I know you would have been sitting there today. Maybe we would have only had a dozen people in the audience, who knows, but I know that you would have been there, and thank you for showing up today. I really appreciate it. So we're going to talk for just a little while about three things that readers ask me a lot about, and that's the genesis of the novel and the research for the novel and character development. So that'll be maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then I'll take your questions. So if you think of questions along the way, please write them down, and we'll be happy to discuss them.
yeah, there's a chat if you want to, and they can ask them in person too.
Oh, good,
On
because
this,
I tend to not look at the chat while
yeah,
I'm talking. So if you can hold on to the questions, I would appreciate it.
yeah.
And
I'll
you'll,
look at the chat,
okay,
and they
thank
can
you.
write them down if they're afraid they'll lose them, but they
Good.
can also ask you in person too.
So I often say that my novels find me. I don't find my novels. And that was certainly true for Eliza Waite, my debut novel in 2016, when my husband Michael and I found an abandoned cabin on a rural island in Washington state. And I stood in that space and I knew that there was a story there. And I embarked then on 8 years of writing and research because I was still working full time at the time at the Nooksack Indian tribe teaching GED classes. And so that story took a long time to simmer and to find its way to the page. As Susan said, I've had great success with Eliza Waite, and very happy about that. But Answer Creek also found me, and it's interesting how that happened. But it's a two-part answer. And the first part of that answer is I believe I was meant to write this novel since the fourth grade. And I'll tell you why. I don't know, those of you who are about my age, If you remember in your school libraries, there was the Landmark series, and it was a series of biographies of famous people. And I just devoured, I think it was actually the brainchild of Bennett Cerf in New York. And he hired writers to do biographies for young adults. This was long before there was really a genre for young adults. And I remember just going down the stacks at North Country Elementary School in Stony Brook, New York, and pulling one after another of those biographies off the shelves. And the one that really struck me at that time, now remember, I'm a New York girl, and I'm reading the story about Narcissa Whitman and how she travels across the country in 1836 with her doctor husband, Marcus, and they set up a mission in Walla Walla, Washington. And I can honestly say that Narcissa Whitman was my first heroine. And so that's the first part of the story. I think I was meant to write this story since fourth grade. And then, of course, at Wheaton, I think, Janice, you're on, another Wheatie, nice to see you. When I was at Wheaton and I majored in American literature and American history, part of my studies were reading volumes of trail stories, mostly Oregon trail stories, but also California trail stories and Mormon trail stories. So to come to this moment that I'm standing in Talkeetna, Alaska, after the whirlwind book tour I had for Eliza Waite in Alaska, because it was set in Skagway in 1898. We're just leaving town and we come to a sign. Dad, you'll get a kick out of this, especially from New York. You get to a stop sign and it says one way to Fairbanks and one way to Anchorage. It's like, you know, you're about at the end of the world at that point. So we turn left and we go toward Anchorage, and we about 5 miles outside of Talkeetna, funky little town in rural Alaska. It's called the Gateway to Denali. It's just a funky little place. We pass over a bridge with a sign that says Answer Creek. And I don't mince words, so I said to my husband, stop the car. So he does what I say. He's a good guy. So we stop the car and we get out and we take a walk along Answer Creek. And it was like the gravitas of that moment. I was like, this is the name of my next novel. I don't even know what my next novel is going to be, but this is the name of my next novel. And so when I got home, I was thinking about the word answer. And I thought, well, if it's an Answer Creek, there has to be a question. And what is that question? What story in the American West needs to be retold in a new way? So right away, I thought of the Donner Party. At that time, there hadn't been a new novel about the Donner Party out in about 15 years. And I thought, if I'm going to spend the next 2 to 4 years of my life writing a novel, because that's what it takes with historical fiction, I'm going to take on the most iconic story of all. I'm going to take on the Donner Party. And I'm going to walk every inch with the Donner Party in present tense, by the way. I write in present tense, so that you as a reader will be walking right alongside Ada Weeks, my fictional protagonist. And she is the only fictional personage in the Donner Party's part of the story. Other people are fictional, but of the 88 people who traveled with the Donner Party, she's the only fictional one. And I wanted to insert her into their narrative. And it also gave me the delicious opportunity to have a character named J.R. Riddle, who lives on Answer Creek. And I absolutely love Riddle's character. Some of his chapters are my most favorite chapters of the book, actually. And I think he deserves a novel of his own, although I won't be writing it because I'm halfway through my third novel and I have ideas for my fourth and my fifth and my sixth novel. And so I will not revisit or do a sequel of any of my books, if that's any of your questions. I'll leave that for someone else to do. So that gave me the opportunity to create this wonderful character, Ada Weeks, who is just full of grit and determination. Most of you are probably very familiar with the Donner Party story, but I'm just going to remind you that these were normal people. These were just everyday farmers and businessmen. They weren't frontiersmen or frontier women. And except for one day, a one-day window, when they could not cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, we would know nothing about them. They would have been just another immigrant party that traveled from Missouri to Oregon or California in the late 1840s, and we would know nothing more about them. Now, I don't know if any of you have read Rinker Buck's The Oregon Trail. It came out about 5 years ago. It's a wonderful nonfiction book. Maybe it's at Peregrine. If it isn't, Susan, you can look into it. Rinker Buck's The Oregon Trail, Simon & Schuster in 2015. And Rinker Buck and his brother Nick, they're kind of like George Will and Billy Carter as brothers, and they travel across the country in an authentic covered wagon pulled by mules. And they make this trip all the way from Independence all the way to Oregon City in Oregon. And it's full of history and it's full of humor, drama. At the end, it's an homage to their father, who instilled a sense of adventure into them in Pennsylvania when he grew up. But there's a line in his book that stuck with me as I was doing my research. His was the first book of nearly 100 books that I read for Answer Creek. And he said that it's the story of the mundane gone madly wrong. And that stuck with me the entire time as I was writing the narrative, that every day I'm going to show all of the mundane activities of day-to-day trail life, but underneath, just undergirding the whole story, is that something went madly wrong. And what went madly wrong, as you might recall, is the Donner Party took an ill-advised cutoff and had to go through the Salt Lake Desert and across Nevada. And so that's just basically the outline of the Donner Party story. So that's a good segue into my research. I did read about 100 books, and what was most helpful is that Michael and I took a trip across country mirroring the Oregon-California Trail in the summer of 2018. We started in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we ended in Sacramento. We took a month to do that trip. And Michael had created a notebook with overlays of maps, and we went off-road as much as possible. It's basically I-80 across the center of the country, but we got off-road, as much as we could at historical markers and at small town museums. And without the luxury of talking to these people, like I feel like I know these people. I feel like I know James Reed, and I feel like I know George and Jacob Donner. You do that much research and you're involved with them every minute of every day. For those of you novelists out there, you'll know what I'm talking about. Your characters are with you all the time as if they're real people, whether they're from history or they're fictional. So even if you're not sitting at your desk, you could be washing the dishes, or you could be folding your laundry, or you could be driving to the doctor's office. These characters are with you all the time. And so I feel like I know them, but in the absence of talking to them, I needed to hold in my hands the real words of the men and the women who traveled across the country. And a little known museum in Gearing, Nebraska. It's near Scotts Bluff, Nebraska. It's called the Legacy of the Plains Museum. And housed there is the biggest trove of Oregon Trail memorabilia in the Paul and Helen Henderson collection. So Michael and I made arrangements that we could go into the archives there. And I have here some notes from Legacy of the Plains. And these are actual journal entries. Thursday, June 12, 1845. The weather being extremely hot and there not being a single drop of water to be obtained before we got to the gorge, we suffered a great deal from the thirst, as did our poor animals. J. Henry Carleton. April 23, 1847. Made 19 miles today, traveled until dark. Ate a cold bite and went to bed chilly and cold, which is very disagreeable with a parcel of little children. Elizabeth Dixon Smith Gear. And here's one from Chester Ingersoll, June 29, 1847. Today our cattle complained. The dust is very bad. The road is very uneven and the winds amongst the Black Hills. All of the emigrants now begin to see that they have loaded the wagons too heavy. And the last one, Thursday, May 26, 1859, J.A. Wilkinson. Rather cold. Continued our journey up the south side of the South Platte. We haven't anything to lose by going and nothing to make by going back. So these are the type of journals that we read over a 3-day period, boxes and boxes spread out over desks at the Legacy of the Plains Museum. And holding journals, original journals in your hand, white gloved, and just reading them at tables here in the 21st century, you really feel like you reached back into the past, and they're speaking to you. They're speaking to you directly. So I was able to use a lot of those journal entries embedded into the story, and that made it, I think, much more realistic. I know that Janice, at least in her review, told me that she felt like she was walking right next to the immigrants every step of the way, and to have those journal entries at my disposal were invaluable. But also, just being on the trail. I never knew there was so much wind in the middle of this country. It is a windy, windy place on the high plains. And the wind would whistle by my ears, and I would smell different smells, and I would see different flora and fauna. And so being surrounded by the weather, all of these immigrants were surrounded by the weather. I don't know if many of you know this, but all of the immigrants walked 2,000 miles. Nobody rode in a wagon like they do in the movies. You had to be elderly or infirm or had just given birth to be riding in the wagon. The wagon was for your stuff. You walked on the left side. Even the drovers, the cattle drovers, didn't ride up from a wagon seat. They walked on the left side, and they goaded the animals from the left side. So there's so much to learn every page, and you have to get it right. I think it's incumbent on historical novelists to get facts right, and that means the mores and the customs and the dress and the food and the drink, and every page I would say, when were matchsticks invented, or how did they bathe, or how much did sugar cost at Fort Bridger? And so as you're writing, I put XXX, that's my placeholder as I'm writing, so that I can get back and fill in the blank on all of those. on all of those details, because there's tangible things to to remember. There's weather and there's geography and there's time and distance, but there's also intangible things like misogyny and domestic violence and racism. You need to harness all of that. You have to get that into the book somehow without it being an info dump. Like, for instance, I'm not going to say to you, oh, the emigrants had 800 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of lard, 25 pounds of salt and pepper, 200 pounds of beans, 700 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of dried fruit, 75 pounds of coffee. I'm not going to tell you that they had 3,250 cattle or 300 horses or 175 sheep or 23 mules. Like, that's too much information for a reader to digest. So instead, I'm going to leave breadcrumbs along the way. Like, I'm going to say, down to our last 5 pounds of beans, or baked 3 loaves of bread today. I'm just going to leave you breadcrumbs along the way about all of that information that I've had to learn in order to write the story. And here's just, Susan wanted me to do one short reading, so I'll do one short reading here. And this is, let's see, I think it's on page 58. It's July 12th, 1846. And they're at Independence Rock at this point, the travelers. It says, 59 days. Ada makes another tick mark on the side of Rosie's worn leather saddlebag. Augustus had said it would take roughly 153 days to reach California. If his reckoning is correct, the immigrants are about a third of the way to the promised land. And if all goes according to plan, should reach California by late September or early October at the latest. But here she is, 59 days into the journey, without Augustus to help count the long, dry, dust-filled hours. And then again, on July 18, 1846, the Great Divide. Ada spins slowly, the Antelope Hills to her south, the Wind River chain to her north, and a wide, flat, endless plain of sagebrush ahead and behind her, nothing but earth and sky. Wind prowls over the divide, and wisps of dark hair fan out behind her as she turns in the thin, dry mountain air. She closes her eyes and catches her breath. Her heart beats fast as if in anticipation. For all their traveling, all the mornings chaining up and tolerating dust, the windstorms, hail, torrents of rain, death, arguments, and beams, the overlanders have crossed the backbone of the continent. They are now halfway to California. So that's the way that I can put that kind of information into a book without it being a complete info dump to a reader, which really bogs down the book. But most people are really interested in the character of Ada, and she's based loosely on the physical and mental and emotional traits of one of my dearest friends in junior high. And I had hoped that she was going to be on today, Anne Aylesworth, but perhaps she couldn't be on today. So when I was writing Ada's story, I would ask, what would Ada do? And I didn't have to ask a brick wall. I could call or text or FaceTime with Anne and ask her how she would handle a certain situation or how she felt about a certain issue or event. And I won't reach any confidentiality, but she helped me on some crucial passages, including the fact that she has been adopted and how that works into your psyche when you've been adopted. So her resilience, both Anne's resilience in life and Ada's resilience, is what I admire most about both of them. There's something called the resilience theory, and that is, it doesn't really matter what adversity that you face, it's how you deal with that adversity. And so I would look to Anne when Ada was facing any of her obstacles and and Anne would help me then to create that character. So Ada is very much imbued with Anne's traits, but she's also her own person. And she's a flawed character, as all authors know. We have to write flawed characters. We're not going to write flat characters or stock characters. All of our characters have to have needs and wants, and they have to have obstacles and struggles that they need to overcome, and they need to show their vulnerabilities, so that none of us is perfect. And so we need to show that in our characters, that they are also flawed. But the bottom line about this story is that I focused on the immigrants' collective humanity. I didn't want to write a salacious tale about the Donner Party. I wanted to write about real people and real struggles, what they went through, what they thought, how they acted, and even those who came through, the guilt that they had of surviving is very palpable in the novel. And we go to great lengths as human beings to survive in the harshest conditions, and we know that from some of the travesties in history. And the Donner Party goes down in American history as one of the most profound. So I wanted to just get inside of that story and walk that story with Ada and bring that story to light and to all of you. So that's basically my story about the genesis of the novel and the research for the novel and the character development. So happy to take any of your questions.
Oh, most everyone is muted, so if you can unmute yourself to ask questions, that would be a good, that's the only way you can do it, because I don't see any, well, I don't see any chat.
I have a question.
Good.
So Ashley, how daunting was it to take on a subject that has been written about fairly extensively? How did you approach it, that you were going to come out with something original and new or different?
Thanks, Lori. Well, yes, there have been 343 books written about the Donner Party at the time when I decided to write the novel. But again, at that point, there hadn't been a novel in about 15 years. And I never really read a novel where I didn't have a bad taste in my mouth about the Donner Party. And I don't mean that as a joke. That is, I wanted to tell the story differently. I wanted to tell it about real people, what they needed to do to survive, and how they were no different from any one of us. How do we really know what we would do in a situation like that? Like, first I had Ada being so righteous that when Ma Breen gives her, the dog leg, that she doesn't eat it. And my editor said, "Are you kidding me? Like, she's starving. She's going to eat the dog leg." So I had to internalize that these were people who just did what they needed to do to survive. And contrary to popular belief, no one was murdered in the Donner Party. There's a question that perhaps the last person left at the lake, Louis Keseberg, murdered the last two toddlers and perhaps murdered Tamsin Donner, but he denied that his whole life. That the people who were consumed in cannibalism had died natural deaths, and many of them had been buried under the snow for a number of days or weeks before people were so desperate that they felt that they had to meet the need to partake. So I will tell you, Lori, though, I had you have this just, you just feel it in your heart. A year before Answer Creek came out, I read that there was going to be a novel about the Donner Party called Hunger by Al Makatsu. And my heart just dropped into my stomach. It was like, I've already done 3 years of research. I've got my contract, I'm in edits, and here there's a new story about the Donner Party. Well, it turns out it's a paranormal novel, and so it's in a completely different genre as mine. And after I got over my initial shock and I actually read the book, I thought, there are so many people interested in the Donner Party. It wouldn't matter if there were 643 books out on it. People who want to read about the Donner Party are anxious to read whatever new book is out. So I did feel better after that, but to answer basically your question, I just felt like I wanted to do a new take on it. And the new take was, these were normal folks.
Do we have any other questions? You can unmute yourself if you have a question.
Sure, it's Janice. Hi, Ashley. So good to see you.
You too.
I put this in the chat, but I'll go ahead and ask you. Read obviously Answer Creek and Eliza Waite and enjoyed both of them. Both of them are very strong, beautiful female protagonists. How would Answer Creek have been different if you had a male protagonist and his point of view?
How is Ada?
If you had had a male protagonist and his point of view in Answer Creek instead of Ada, how would it have been different? How would it have been a different story? Or would it?
Well, I think it definitely would have been a different story. I decided not to write from a male perspective because I don't feel like I understand the male perspective and I don't want to appropriate it. I was able to do that somewhat with Riddle, but my protagonist will always be female because I feel like I can go deep into myself and the well of myself and conjure up a character. But a very interesting point, Janice, is that the majority of the men perished on this journey and more women survived than men. And there's many reasons behind that. I've talked about it before in a couple of other panels, and it's not just because we have more body fat. I think there's something just inherent, especially about mothers wanting to protect their children, that once the men had been so busy in the prime of their lives doing this journey, and when they were stuck at the lake, they gave up. They basically just gave up and died. And the women stayed alive and kept the kids alive for the most part. So it would have been a different story because very few of the men actually survived the journey.
Did not know that. That's very interesting.
We have a question from Linda that you partially answered, but she might have come in late, wondering why Ada and others didn't ride in the wagons, and that said Ada walked the whole way.
Right. Again, most of the immigrants walked the entire 2,000 miles, and it was at 2 miles an hour. Now you might not think that's very fast, but when Michael and I did the cross-country journey, we took an authentic wagon trail ride for a whole day in Casper, Wyoming. And for part of that journey, we did ride in the wagon, but then we wanted to get out and see what does 2 miles an hour really feel like. And my goodness, it's really hard to keep up because the wagon doesn't stop the entire time. And you are having to skirt around boulders and sagebrush and watching for snakes and, dust getting in your face and, the whole world going on around you, and you're trying to keep up with this wagon. It was really difficult to keep up with it. And then think that women were wearing about 15 pounds of clothing. So we probably wear maybe 3 to 5 pounds of clothing now, but add, triple that they had 15, pounds of clothing, let alone, using the facilities or menstruating or childbirth. The wagons didn't really stop for these things. They may stop a half a day for a funeral or a half a day for a childbirth. And then if you're elderly or infirm, or if you had just given birth, you could ride in the wagon, for a couple of days. But the wagon was really meant for all of your supplies. And so the majority, 99% of the people walked the entire way, and averaged 18 miles a day. And so once I walked 12 miles in one day, and that was a workout. And I thought, well, what would that be like if I had to do that every day, regardless of the weather, regardless of how I feel? And so that I started to internalize all of that about what that would feel like, because I'm like, oh, I'm so proud of myself. I walked 12 miles. Well, they walked 2,000 miles and barely a day of rest. Their rest days were so welcome, where they could wash and they could lollygag in a stream and they could play the fiddle and they could dance and actually take a nap. So it was tough. It was tough going, the walking.
I really admired the way you characterized Ada and how you had her. I mean, she did take us with her through this, but I loved her line about the dying isn't the hardest part. It's staying alive is a lot harder than dying any day. And you could see why when you traveled across the country with them, and of course knowing her experiences. And actually that whole idea in this pandemic where we're all especially then we were really more trapped, like, oh, if I think I have it hard, what about those people?
Right. Yeah, I wrote an article in my local newspaper that if Ada could survive 124 days in a windowless cabin eating shoe leather, that, I didn't have too much to complain about with electricity and plumbing and Netflix. So it put it into perspective. Let's put it that way.
Yes, indeed it did. And the other thing that I was thinking about were the way you presented the dream of going west and California, which in such a non-cliche way. It's with the little things that people were looking forward to. And Ada picturing grapes, real grapes. You made me just mouth water for grapes, which I'm not that crazy about, but I could understand the idea of it because that wasn't something she had.
Right. And in the last chapter, where we're in present time, and Ada's great great granddaughter is popping grapes into her mouth, it's like something you don't even think about.
Yeah.
You've gone to Safeway, you've got a bag of grapes, and you're popping them in your mouth, and that was something that Ada longed for 5.5 months, and then another almost the same amount of time in the cabin. Just what does a grape taste like? She had never had a grape before. And so the simple things that they look forward to, in some ways it was a simpler time, and in other ways it was a much more difficult time. But all in all, I hope that I've created a character who you can walk with and you can empathize with, and a character who can teach you something not only about history, but something about yourself.
How how did you find her within yourself?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know that I would have survived that journey. I don't know that I'm that tough. I wrote that in the afterword. But people have my Western friends, my Lynn Halls of the world have, they've showed me that maybe I'm a little tougher than I think I am. And I've lived in the West now since 1978. And so probably, I don't want to do the math here in real time, but probably half my life anyway, I've lived in the East, and half my life I've lived in the West, maybe more in the West. And so perhaps I am tougher than I think I am. And I really admire Western women. I admire Western women in literature. I admire Western women in real life. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to claim to be a Western woman, being a New Yorker, but I'm living in the West now, and I'm feeling that energy that Western women exude, and I feel very comfortable. I feel very comfortable in the West.
And you have some of the people I see on there are Western women that have been visiting.
A lot of you, I could give you a big hug.
Susan, I have a question. Becky.
Okay, but she's one of the Western women, by the way.
I've just really fallen in love in the last few years with Western fiction. I mean, historical fiction.
Mhm.
And this is so ironic because an archivist is now pulling into my driveway with the very information that I've been waiting for. But what I wanted to ask you is actually some advice. I have a famous relative whose wife is as obscure as if she has never walked the earth. And I want to learn about her life, and I want to learn about her person. And I'm not interested in publishing the great American novel, but I would love to be able to put together a cogent history with me. I even thought when you were talking today, maybe I could write from a friend's perspective and her friend perspective of her and her experiences. I don't know, but just any thoughts on that?
Well, just remember that she is human, and we all have our frailties and we all have our strengths. So even if she comes across as, clean as the driven snow, perhaps she, cheats a little bit on her butter in her recipes, or maybe she said an unkind word to a neighbor once that she regrets. These are the type of things that we have to think of our character as being a fully fleshed out and a multi-layered character. That a character who is purely villainous or purely pure isn't really believable.
Yes, correct.
So we even those characters who weigh in on the more villainous side, like Steiner in My Fate, we find out that he was abused as a little boy and had to go from boy home to boy home to boy home. So there's something in his childhood that really affected who he was as an adult. So,
yes.
So even just thinking about something small that would make her more realistic.
Or at least
I do know saintly people. I really do know some saintly people, but I have to know that they've had at least some impure thoughts, or they have some regrets of something they've said or done. So that would
Surely. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I did very much enjoy the Rinker Buck books, actually both of them. I'm reading Flight of Passage, the book about he and his brother building an airplane and flying it across the country at the age of 14 or something. So, and good writer.
if you're interested in a really, really good narrative nonfiction of the Donner Party, I would suggest Michael Wallace's book. This might also be at Peregrine, and if not, they could order it for you. It's called The Best Land Under Heaven, The Donner Party in the Age of Manifest Destiny. And I used this as a Bible, and I was in contact with Michael Wallace numerous times as I was writing Answer Creek, and he helped me with certain questions. So far, I haven't been called on any errors in the book. There's one very small error in Eliza Waite, and I take complete responsibility for that error. And there very well could be an error, historical error in Answer Creek, but I've done my darndest to make sure that I've brought you a novel. I think you need to trust the author of the books that you're reading. And so I want to do my part as an author, that you can trust me when you pick up my book, that it's going to be historically accurate, but you're also going to get a terrific story. And my next novel is set in Arizona, actually.
Oh, great.
In rural Arizona in 1905.
Will you?
A fictitious town somewhere between Oracle and Globe. And that story found me also through my neighbor Lynn Hall, when she handed me a book called Annie's Guests, about a woman who ran a hotel in Oracle in the late 19th century. And the idea just exploded in my head. And that was a couple of years ago. And now I'm about halfway through that novel, and really looking forward to getting back down to Arizona for many reasons: my neighbors, my friends, the weather, but also to be able to go up to Oracle and Globe and up into the mining district, and again stand in the place where the novel takes place. We boat all summer, so I'm out in Puget Sound on our boat, and I'm writing about the desert, and so it's like there's a disconnect there. So I'm very much looking forward to being back down in the desert and standing there and being able to have the place become part of the narrative.
That's interesting, because I remember Leslie Marmon Silko, who wrote the wonderful book Ceremony, got a MacArthur for it, was in Alaska. She was raised in New Mexico desert, but she was in Alaska where there was 70 inches of rain, and she was writing about the desert, and she was, trying to conjure up some end of the rain.
It's a real dichotomy.
Yes, it is.
And I want to thank you again for coming in to the conversation today. And I really want to thank Peregrine and Susan for welcoming me. As you can imagine, during COVID, most of my events were canceled, if not postponed. And this is my only Arizona event. I have 3 other bookstore events coming up in California and Oregon and in Washington. I'm looking forward to those. But you can follow me online at ashleysweeneyauthor.com. I'm active on social media, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. But I really want to put in a plug for Peregrine, especially for those of you who have already bought Answer Creek and you won't be going in to purchase Answer Creek there. Think about Peregrine when the holidays are coming and you're buying a book for someone. I've ordered some books from Peregrine myself, including Susan's novel, which I'm very much looking forward to reading, one of Susan's novels. And they will ship for you for a very, very small fee. So if you could support Peregrine, that would be wonderful. If you have Answer Creek already, think about ordering another book, and also support your own local bookstores, because they really need you at this time.
Thank you for saying that, because we all do. And we also want to keep having events, whether you're there or not. And maybe you'll be here when your next book comes out, because hopefully by then we'll have in-person events.
And I'll look forward to meeting all of you Prescott folks at that time.
Yep.
Great.
Well, thank you very much Ashley. Thank you for doing this. I've enjoyed it. I just love your book. And if anyone by any chance hasn't read it, for God's sake, please do. You won't regret a minute of it.
Mm.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And if there's no more questions, raise your hand quick. All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Bye,
And
Dad.
Hi,
I've
Ashley.
enjoyed your questions. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.